I will begin. My name is Debbie Biaki, and I am one of the co-leads at Youth for Ecocide Law. Today, I'm joined by my other co-lead and the co-founder as well of Stop Ecocide International. It's going to be a briefing and a bit of a Q&A on all the questions you might have in regards to the Ecocide Law and the organization Stop Ecocide International and Youth for Ecocide Law. As we begin, I'll read a foreword to this session. At present, individuals are not held criminally accountable when it's proven that their decisions have led to devastating environmental damage, such as vast chemical or oil spills or the clear cutting of primary rainforests. Ecocide legislation removes an individual's ability to shelter behind the limited liability of corporations or the impunity that comes with being part of a ruling government. It fundamentally reconfigures the moral and legal order in favor of nature, and in turn, all of us that rely on it for our prosperity and survival. So join Stop Ecocide International co-founder, as I introduced, Jojo Mehta, and myself and Leah to learn about the most significant recent developments in the world and the line of ecocide law and how to get involved. So briefly, to break down how the session will be, we'll have a brief introduction of Youth for Ecocide Law with Leah, and then we'll move to Jojo's update. Then the Q&A will come towards the end, and we'll see how to run through that. So that being said, I'll pass it over to Leah for a presentation on what Youth for Ecocide Law is.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's briefing. Thank you, Debbie, for the introduction. And yes, feel free to ask questions in the Q&A section as we go along, and we'll try and keep an eye out, but also towards the end, and try and answer as many questions that you might have as possible. I have the pleasure to give you a very brief introduction to what ecocide law is, but also Youth for Ecocide Law, and then Jojo will dive more into the specifics and just the general updates that have been happening. Hopefully you will have heard quite a few, the word ecocide buzzing around in the news quite a bit lately. So yeah, I'm really excited to be here with you today, and hopefully inspire you to join us and join our campaign. So the problem is that we're currently facing, imagine prosecuting or murder like without it actually being a crime. And that's kind of the problem that we also have with environmental crimes, because currently the worst crimes are not illegal almost anywhere in the world. And that poses a big challenge to international environmental law, which is why the campaign is to make ecocide a crime, an international crime. What is ecocide, you might ask? Ecocide is mass destruction of the environment. And in 2021, legal experts came together to put forward a definition, which is unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. So, sure, we'll discuss that definition a little bit further as well. But next, let me dive into what do we want to do with that? Well, the idea is to bring it to the International Criminal Court, which hosts the Rome Statute. And the Rome Statute sets out the worst crimes and the worst atrocities happening in the world and prosecutes them. It currently tries 4 crimes: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes of aggression. And yes, the idea is to make ecocide the 5th crime. Missing crime. Anyway, how would that work? Well, first it would have to be proposed to the Rome Statute for an amendment. Then, in order for it to be admissible, a majority of those present need to be voting at the meeting for the proposal, and then need to be, for an adoption to happen, 2/3, so 82 of the states parties to the Rome Statute need to support the amendment, and then finally to ratify it. Finally, and that also makes it ecocide law into their national domestic jurisdiction within a year of ratification. So that's something really exciting about how international law then also influences domestic law. And as we can see, also works the other way around as well. We see domestic developments increasingly pushing towards international law. So yeah, unlike suing and finding corporations who, can simply budget for this possibility, making ecocide a crime creates an arrestable offense, and it makes individuals who are responsible for acts or decisions that lead to severe environmental harm liable to criminal prosecution. Impacts are and the aim is to draw international attention and increase climate ambition, or also environmental protection ambition, and to prosecute high-level perpetrators that commit ecocide. It's also to catalyze national laws around the world and catalyze sort of prosecutions outside national jurisdictions, so it can also influence also be very relevant to countries that are not parties to the Rome Statute. And really, the idea is to transform it from a norm of something, yes, we all know that mass destruction of the environment shouldn't happen, to something that is legally enforceable, that is a law. Very briefly, we have with us here today from Stop Ecocide International. It's co-founded by Polly Higgins and Jojo Mehta. We have with us here today Jojo Mehta, who's going to give us updates and insights into Stop Ecocide International, into the developments that are happening internationally. But more specifically, I want to quickly talk about the youth movement behind it. So around 2 years or so ago, in 2022, Youth for Ecocide Law was founded as a branch of Stop Ecocide International. And our aim is really to involve youth in this process, to raise awareness about ecocide law, and to harness the voice and the power of youth around the world to campaign for an ecocide law in countries around the world. And also to promote some of the amazing work of youth and other youth organizations that we partner with at panels, at speaking events, and to participate in high-level conferences where youth are also present and get to include in policy statements such as like the climate conferences that are happening, but also support like climate strike, global action events, and raise awareness about it on social media as well. We have a network, just general, that's open to everyone, that I would, if you're not on it, highly invite you to join the network chat. It's open to anyone, where you can get updates on what's happening. And around once a month, we also have a network meeting to just give updates on what's happening in the Stop Ecocide movement, in the Youth for Ecocide movement. And then we have the core team that creates initiatives, that outlines the mission for the year and plans for events. And that meets sort of bi-weekly or weekly, depending on sort of need and what's happening. For example, for a big conference, that might be more often. And yes, we're also looking to expand the group, but I should explain our structure, because also Youth for Ecocide Law is growing, and it's really exciting, because obviously we have the international group, but we also have a very strong Youth for Ecocide Law Africa group, so regional group. And recently, from this year, we have a student ambassador group, which is looking at ecocide law more in a university and a student perspective. So when you're considering to join, it's also interesting to look at where would you fit in with that? Do you want to join the global group, or do you want to look at something specifically within your university setting? So there's different options, let's just say it that way. Some initiatives from last year sort of include Earth Day, presence at COP28, also compiling an art book that's still ongoing, looking for more people to help with that. And, raising awareness, publishing articles, expanding partnerships with other youth NGOs. We love working with other youth groups, and sort of looking at how can we all combine in our missions, because ecocide law is just such an overarching goal that can really synergize with a lot of other movements. And this year, we've already had so much going on, considering it's only the 5th month of the year, with Earth Week celebrations, Twitter Spaces. We launched the French and Spanish toolkits now. We obviously already have an English toolkit, which we'll also share in the chat for those interested. Maybe also went to some UN conferences, United Nations Environment Programme, UNEA 6 conference, social media campaigns, articles, journals, and the launch of the student ambassador team. So lots going on, and we're looking to grow and strengthen our team. Also encourage everyone to just speak and share about ecocide, which is why we have the toolkit. It gives you insight on on do's and don'ts and how to answer common questions and just how to get involved in any way that you feel called to do so, and just empower you with tools on how to speak about this and share the message. Yeah, we have like this our email as well. As I already said, there's the WhatsApp chat for the network group, and we're also on social media, and we'll share a form towards the end or now as well again, to apply to the core team. And yeah, if you're interested in helping organizing, you have time to volunteer, that would be fantastic. But yes, before we do that, feel free to ask any questions in the chat that you might have to me, and then to Jojo as well. And I'm going to hand it back over to Debbie and Jojo next.
All right, thank you so much for that. There's some few things I'd like to highlight. When we describe or define youth, we go with the UN definition, so from 18 to 35. However, our students group is quite broader. We have a lot of overlapping roles, but our student group goes beyond the 35 age. So you could be a student, but you're over 35, but you can still mobilize about ecocide in your university. So you're welcome to join the students group. And for the first question that came in the chat about the slides, if you could send us an email at youth@stopecocide.earth, we'll sure to send you those slides. That being said, we're doing quite great with time. So I'll pass it over to Jojo for her remarks.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's really great to be here. And it's been really exciting seeing the Ecocide Law Network just, growing and getting so active. I'm just amazed at how much has already happened this year, seeing what Leah just presented, which is fantastic. So Stop Ecocide International has been going since 2017. And we're essentially, I suppose you could describe us as a kind of expert advocacy organization. And that's sort of something that crosses a number of different areas, but we have kind of two main areas that we work. One is at the sort of high level diplomatic, sort of legal advisor, ambassadors, politicians, those kinds of meetings and convenings, which are mostly closed doors. So you don't necessarily see that those conversations coming up in our public presence. But the other and very broad part of what we do is all about stewarding and fostering the conversation around ecocide, because we know that politicians don't like to be the first to a party. They want to know they're joining a conversation that's already happening, and that it is therefore safe for them to take part in. And we already know as well from our sort of UN level work that the civil society awareness raising that we've been different to how the conversation goes with legislators. And the way that we approach that advocacy work is very collaborative, it's very cross-sector, it's very international. And what we do is invite, any organizations or, people in all kind of walks of life to join in with the conversation. And for example, a lot of what we do at UN conferences are collaborative events with lots of different organizations. And effectively, we kind of platform people to talk about what they want to talk about, as long as they link it with ecocide law, because as Leah mentioned, the criminalization of the worst harms to nature is a foundational piece that actually supports all other environmental campaigning. So, we're very much in a kind of and relationship with every environmental organization on the planet, really. I mean, even if we're not concretely in sort of direct contact with everybody, which of course is impossible, we're nonetheless very much feel that there's a kind of relationship of collaboration, a relationship of support in terms of ecocide law. And I guess we ultimately aim, as Leah said, for this to be adopted as an international crime. And when we started out, we specifically aimed for the International Criminal Court, because that's where the crimes that are considered globally to be the worst crimes are addressed. And one of the sort of, in a sense, the biggest issue that we were kind of looking at addressing with this is that although there is plenty of environmental law around the world, on the whole, it is not taken terribly seriously. there's not a huge amount of moral stigma attached to breaching an environmental regulation, which happens all the time. And even those crimes that do exist in the environmental space internationally, for example, wildlife trafficking or illegal logging or those kinds of things, they're already as lucrative in the criminal world as drug trafficking. There's something like third or fourth most lucrative criminal activity in the world, but in comparison, they're not investigated, they're not reported, they're not prosecuted. So, you know, it's minuscule in comparison, the actual amount of focus that gets given to enforcing that. And we believe that that is largely due to a really major cultural gap, particularly in the kind of Western mindset, which has come, as we know, to dominate the economic, you know, the global economic system. So that kind of cultural mindset sort of grew up in a time where nature was considered a bank of resources and an infinite bank of resources, just, you know, raw environmental resources, but also other people. And that attitude has effectively embedded itself so deeply in the economic system that now kind of effectively is the global dominant system. And that means that nature is considered something other. Nature is considered something that we're not part of as humans. In fact, there's even a campaign going on at the moment to include humans in the dictionary definition of nature, because right now, the Oxford English Dictionary and many other dictionaries describe nature as something other than people, excluding people. So it just gives you a really kind of a sense of how kind of embedded that concept is. And it means that we don't take harm to nature as seriously as we should. And of course, what we realize, and particularly what we realize as soon as we go out of the kind of Western Europe type context, is that actually massive harm to nature and human rights violations, for example, are often hugely closely interconnected. Not taken as seriously as it should be. This means that, you know, that also has huge knock-on effects on communities as well. So the aim in creating an international crime is to kind of both to create a responsibility for those in positions of power. So it's those who are kind of at the top, if you like, of the kind of production chains and the decision-making structures, because that's how the international crimes work, but also to clearly convey that mass destruction of the environment is as bad, as serious, as dangerous as mass destruction of property and people. And I think sometimes people say, well, you know, how can you put something like ecocide alongside something like genocide? What you have to look at in those instances is the difference between the intent and the result. Because with genocide, obviously, it is quite conceivably the most evil intent in the world, the intent to destroy a people in whole or in part. That's what's required to meet the crime of genocide. But with ecocide and the way that the proposed definition's been defined, it acknowledges the fact that with destruction of the environment, it's not normally a direct intention. People don't normally set out to destroy the environment. They set out to make money or to, you know, to engage in a particular industrial activity. And this is the collateral damage that happens on a, you know, sometimes on a really vast scale. So it's when you contrast with the consequences, then you really see why ecocide needs to be acknowledged as a really serious crime. Because actually, when we massively destroy the environment, that actually has huge knock-on effects, but not just on the living world itself, but around us that we completely depend on, but also on us and on people and on communities. And often disproportionately on those communities that have the least power to deal with it immediately. And so it's a way of creating accountability. And as Leah said, of having those decision makers, when they're at the drawing board stage of projects, to actually think about it in a different way. And a really good way to illustrate this is that the way people treat environmental regulation, which is often very, very specific and prescriptive, they're kind of like, well, we're not using exactly this level of this toxin in this context, and therefore we're not committing, you know, we're not breaking a regulation. Or, you know, if this is the thing that's not allowed, well, we'll just recategorize what we're doing and we'll say that actually we're doing something else, and therefore, you know, we're not going to fall foul of the law. Or worst case scenario, which does certainly happen, is how much will it cost us to deal with the court case versus how much are we going to make if we just go ahead? And those are the kinds of equations that happen currently around environmental regulation. But when you bring in something that says anything that you do that is going to create this severe and either widespread or long-term harm, you know, anything that hits that kind of level of danger is potentially a serious crime, you bring in a very different attitude. So instead of people approaching it as mitigating their sort of risk of breaching a regulation, instead it starts to be treated a bit more like maybe like you would treat a health and safety principle. You know, you're not going to build a factory so that it almost breaks people's heads open all the time. Ultimately, we're aiming to foster with this conversation, but also with the law itself when it's in place. So so yeah, and so to kind of give a bit of a an update on what's happening with this initiative globally, it's actually really exciting. So I mean, in a world that is currently at the moment chaotic and I think to many depressing and scary, we're actually looking at one initiative that does seem to be making headway in a positive way. I'm sure it's not the only one, but it's certainly very exciting for us that it is. So 5 years ago, nobody was talking about ecocide. I mean, no governments were publicly talking about ecocide. Just a couple of months ago, the European Union adopted an environmental crimes directive that would address conduct comparable to ecocide in a whole range of circumstances. And that now has to be harmonized into the criminal law of the European member states. So to go from nothing to EU legislation in 5 years for international law, that's kind of rocket speed. International law is not a fast moving thing normally. I mean, how long did the Paris Agreement take to reach? I mean, 20 something years. So, you know, this is a movement, this is an initiative that is growing very fast. And in the last year alone, I think around 8 countries also had parliamentary proposals in their domestic jurisdictions of ecocide law as well. So this is something that this is a conversation that has really grown fast. And what that means is that now, I mean, we've been working alongside some very, actually, interestingly, I think it's fascinating that and very human and very sobering that the countries that are at the forefront of this conversation are victim countries. So Vanuatu, which is one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world, Ukraine, which is obviously suffering from a severe conflict situation, have been the 2 loudest voices, you know, on the international diplomatic stage around ecocide law, which is really interesting. But we have, as an organization, we've been working with countries like that over the last few years, particularly to bring the conversation forward at the International Criminal Court. And we've done we've done official side events for 5 years in a row. There have been various countries that have included ecocide in their statements. So Vanuatu, Belgium, which has now actually legislated for ecocide, is the first European country to do so domestically. But also other countries like Samoa, Finland, the Maldives. There have been a number of countries. But what we've seen this year since the European developments is that conversation has done a kind of quite a profound gear shift. So it's no longer a question of, you know, whether this is going to happen. It's more about how is it going to happen and when is it going to happen. And that's, you know, a very kind of, it's sort of tangible within those sort of diplomatic conversations. So that's very exciting. So we are looking this year potentially to to continue to support those states that are courageous enough to move forward with this, and to continue to have conversations in many different countries around the world. We now have associate groups or teams in about 50 countries, which is just amazing. Again, you know, a few years ago it was just, you know, 2 or 3 countries. Now it's 50, which is just amazing. So fostering all of those conversations to move that conversation forward at the highest level. And we anticipate that it's entirely possible. I mean, with diplomatic work, we can never guarantee, But we think that since these developments have over the last sort of year or so, it's not impossible that we could see a proposal for an amendment to the Rome Statute being put on the table this year. It could be as early as this year. So, I mean, and what that means, I mean, you obviously heard the steps from Leah, but in practice, what that means is it means the opening of a conversation, of a diplomatic conversation that then obviously needs to be negotiated. But what this initiative has that previous amendments to the Rome Statute have not had, I've been thinking, you know, the crime of aggression, there's been starvation amendments, all important amendments. But what they didn't necessarily have was what Ecocide Law now does have, which is a global movement. And that's why it's so important. That's why we're having this conversation today, because those conversations that happen in individual countries and in individual sectors and in different groups like youth groups, faith groups, different networks that are also kind of building up, you know, whether it's farmers, whether it's business people and so on, all of that helps to sort of move that dial, to sort of push that needle. So I think I'll probably leave it there for the introduction, but it's just, yeah, it's very, very exciting moment to be coming in on this conversation.
Exactly. Thank you so much for the rundown and the update on where we are so far. I'm keeping an eye on the chat. The questions are coming in really fast and nice. So I will start throwing them, considering we made this to be an interactive session and Q&A. So a few questions came in early, and I think I will be asking them in pairs. So number one to Jojo, will the Ecocide Law be charged in times of war and peace, and how will that play out? And the second question is, what happens to countries that commit ecocide and are not part of the ICC?
Okay, yeah, both really good questions. So a standalone crime of ecocide, which is what we advocate for, would apply in times of conflict as well as times of peace. It would probably have slightly different effects. I mean, obviously the same text, but it would have slightly different effects in different contexts. So we talk a lot, particularly within the peacetime context, of ecocide law as a deterrent. And as something that would have people think carefully before they engage in a particular profit-making project, for example. In the context of conflict, the environment is pretty much always a serious and a silent victim of conflict, you know, regardless of what else is happening. The issue that we have at the moment in conflict situations is that the environment tends to be sidelined in terms of the focus. There's, you know, people are becoming more vocal around that in the last couple of years, but you know, sort of historically, and also I would say understandably in a way, I mean, you know, human casualties and the damage to infrastructure and so on that happen in conflict are understandably front of mind for people that are dealing with that from a legal perspective, also from a human perspective. But what, of course, is often the case with environmental damage in armed conflict is that it often has effects that extend beyond the area of the conflict, so geographically, but also temporally. So, you know, I mean, for example, I mean, in Ukraine, I think it's now the biggest area of landmines territory in the world, and it will take a very, very long time to remedy that, even once, you know, the conflict is no longer taking place. And of course, when there are really severe destruction, when there's really severe destruction of the environment, that can have incredibly long-term, even generational length time effects. So, but because of the way that just the way that conflict plays out, it's more likely to be not necessarily a deterrent, but more of a sense of creating a level of justiciability. So a level of the ability to potentially then prosecute for those crimes, but the crimes have to be in place for them to be justiciable. Now, the Rome Statute does have one particular provision that is supposed to address conflict damage, but in practice, it has been shown to be quite difficult to actually apply it. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if that's completely comprehensive, but hopefully approaches that a bit. And with the non-ICC countries, that's quite interesting because, well, firstly, the non-ICC countries don't get to vote on whether the ICC has a crime of ecocide or not, which is potentially a political advantage in terms of moving it forward. But in terms of being able to reach those countries, there are ways. So, I mean, let's say, the US is not a member of the ICC, but let's say a US company was committing ecocide in a country that was a member and did ratify the crime, then a case could be taken in that country. Or, for example, if somebody that involved in that criminal act was either based in or a resident of or came from a country that is a member, then that could also create a context for a prosecution. And of course, the other thing is that with the sort of interconnections of the global economy, the more countries ratify this crime, the more marginalized the polluting countries become. Because obviously, ultimately, as more countries join, eventually those countries that are not members or that have not created their own ecocide laws will end up effectively only able to, but if they want to continue to pollute, they'll be having to do it in their own backyards. So it will become, there'll be kind of a process of, if you like, beginning to see happen, because we're beginning to see countries say, oh, look, we can see that in Europe they've now legislated in this direction. So there's a direction of travel that's already in movement.
All right, so on to the next set. Tori asks, could we have a more specific example or case study of a country that has put in place the Ecocide Law and what the ramifications or effects will be? I guess that would be Belgium, so you could go ahead.
Yes, I mean, actually, there's two examples that I would give. Actually, one for peace and one for conflict. So, Belgium has just put in place a law of ecocide. I've frozen. Can you still hear me? Yeah. Okay, good. Sorry, I think my internet connection went a bit wobbly there. Actually, with Belgium, it's so new that there are no prosecutions currently pending. But for example, it includes the activities of Belgian companies acting elsewhere. It also would it has a certain limitation in Belgium because there are regional legislative issues there as well. So within Belgium itself, the regions also need to kind of coordinate with what's happening at the federal level. So the story isn't completely complete there. But for example, I mean, we could think about France that also has ecocide, at least nominally, in its penal code. It's not as strong a definition as we would probably have liked to see at the international level, for example, but there is already a pollution case being taken, a chemical pollution case being taken in France. We could look at Ukraine, where they do have a provision for ecocide in their national legislation. And they are looking at putting together, I think it's at least a dozen different cases of ecocide in relation to the conflict damage. And so, but again, it's quite early days. I mean, it's interesting because I think part of that question is around, where has it worked and, what's happened historically. But it is actually quite a new conversation, even in those countries that have had it in their penal codes for some time. And we actually believe that part of the reason that these laws are now being examined and cases being prepared is precisely because of the conversation that has been nurtured and the legislation that is moving forward now around ecocide. It's having those countries which do have provision start to look at it and think, right, how can we use this? So, we are kind of at the cutting edge here of a sort of legislative direction.
Right, that's a great answer, actually. And of course, it's something that will come in place with time. And with our speed, I think we're really moving fast, which is great. So I think more examples will be given in a future webinar. So on to the next question. I think today we're going to turn you into a lawyer a bit, but we'll see how we can manage. There's a question that's long shot says, how will countries that are not part of certain unions, in this question, it's the European Union and the UK not being part of it anymore. I think there's also a ripple effect in the African Union. So if it's passed in the AU and one country is not part of the AU, but they're part of the ICC, like how is the balance between that?
Hey, that's an interesting one. I mean, from a legal perspective, I wouldn't be able to answer that in detail. But in terms of, I mean, for example, the UK not being part of the EU means that the UK isn't directly bound by the EU laws, but it means that if a UK player was committing, a crime or an offence that would fall under the EU law, that in one of the EU countries, then it would be justiciable in that country. So again, it's a little bit that question of you become more marginalized as to where you can commit pollution. But I think the other thing that's I think that you again start touching on that aspect of connectivity that we see inevitably with the global economy. So the more countries put something like this in place, the more other countries will either feel the need to do so, or they will actually be, effectively in, their own sort of supply chains and so on will be entangled within that legal space. So they will have to take account of it in some way. I mean, obviously there are big countries like Russia and India and China that are not members of the ICC and that effectively must, will internally would be dealing with their own legal situations. But generally speaking, as soon as you start getting cross-border transactions, you're looking at the influence of international law reaching even those countries.
All right, I think it's quite the balance, but in a sense, it covers so much, and law has, especially criminal law, has a way to tighten some loose ends. So this is maybe one of those examples that you could be caught here through here if you're not, even if you're not part of here.
Yeah.
So that's one of
Absolutely.
the examples. Yeah.
It's kind of like it's not like a silver bullet that will catch everybody everywhere,
Right.
but it's a kind of, it's almost like a container, because there's so much that falls between the cracks with environmental law that, it's one thing to breach a regulation. It's another thing to breach a regulation and threaten ecocide where you might have to deal with a criminal law. So yeah.
Right. I will take you off the spotlight a bit to turn it to Leia. And there's a question that asks on how we could merge with them or other interested parties. I guess our audience is also connected to different youth networks. So how could we join, or how could we integrate certain ways and workings of Youth for Ecocide Law with other people?
So you mean as a youth and another youth organization, right? So we have a couple of partner organizations. You can check it actually on our website, on the website they're listed there as well. But basically what we do is we do like events together. We also unite, for example, if there's like youth statements for like conferences, such as like Stockholm Plus 50 was a strong youth statement that was put together by several youth groups, including Youth for Ecocide Law, that had ecocide as a demand. The same goes for sort of the big like conferences, COP, etc. So you can contribute sort of to youth statements all together. Or for example, a concrete one that we did recently was when the ICC prosecutor, Office of the Prosecutor called for consultation process on prosecuting environmental crimes under the Rome Statute. We did a combined consultation response together with World Youth for Climate Justice. So yeah, that's sort of like an example of how we would maybe work together with another youth NGO to like put forward a statement, put our voices together. And or just host events together. We do for like Earth Week, we did quite a few collaborations with Ghan Youth Hub, so Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, and we had an Earth Day discussions on that. So yeah, those are just some like concrete examples of how we have worked with youth NGOs together with other youth NGOs together with in the past. But yeah, open to suggestions and collaborations, so feel free to just email us.
All right, as I also mentioned, I will put in the chat a link to our application form for the core team. It closes on the 31st of May. So that's one way we could start collaborating in the works you do and ours. And I will go to the next question, and I'll turn it over to Jojo. I think this is also a two-part question from my side. How does Ecocide aim to convey and integrate law into an industrial era or a vicarious economy era? What are the strategies that have been set or negotiated? I think I could ask this question in two parts. Presently, how could the Ecocide Law be deal with that? And also in the past, like we know there are companies that have committed ecocide before even the ICC was formed and all that. How will that historical crime also be, I think, put inside ecocide as well?
Understood. I think I'll probably take the second part of that first. And the key thing to say here is that, you know, much as this may be disappointing, law on the whole doesn't act retroactively. So the ecocide law will apply from when it is put in place. One won't be able to go backwards and say, well, you know, ecocide was committed 10 years ago, so now we're going to prosecute it. It would have to be something that is taking place at the time or after the law is put in place. And although that, as I say, that can be disappointing because obviously there are some very awful cases of ecocide that have happened in the past. But at the same time, it's actually quite important, and it speaks to a really important aspect of criminal law, which is that it's actually about protection. So ideally, what we're aiming to do with this law is not so much put people in jail, although we have no doubt whatsoever that that will occur at some point. It's not so much that, it's more about having people think carefully before they act, because the whole point is to change behavior. What we're really aiming to do here is, if we genuinely want to protect ourselves and the living world, what we need to do is change our attitudes and behavior. And that is something that criminal law has a unique, as far as systemic interventions are concerned, criminal law has a unique capacity to do that. And I think one way of looking at that is that there's this kind of crossover point between cultural awareness and legislation. So the example I always use is one from my home country of the UK, where there was a criminal law passed in 1989 called the Child Protection Act, which basically made it a criminal act to, you know, beat your child, for example, as a form of discipline. Now, at that time, there were still people, I mean, I actually still know people whose parents campaigned against that law in the 80s because they believed they had the God-given right to discipline their child exactly how they wanted. Now, but there was enough consciousness about the fact that that was wrong for the law to be put in place. But subsequently, because the law is in place, the overall culture has shifted hugely, so that now if you were to stop someone and say, is it okay to beat your child? Nobody will tell you yes, not in this country. And so, you know, so there's this kind of interface that happens. And I think that what we want is, we want people to see it coming so that they can actually start already adjusting the thinking that they're using at sort of, you know, board level and project, you know, where people are drawing up projects, so that, and okay, there's another way of putting this. We would not support this law coming into place immediately overnight, because if we did that, there would be a kind of chaotic response where courts wouldn't be able to deal with it, politicians wouldn't know where to put themselves, businesses wouldn't have time to adjust, all of that sort of thing. And what we want is to take everybody with us. You know, we don't want it to be a kind of confrontational situation, which is actually just not feasible or manageable. And to go back to, sorry, you're gonna have to remind me the first part now again. The first part of the question, sorry.
Let me read it again. How does Ecocide aim to convey and integrate law to an industrial era? And what are the strategies that have been put or are being negotiated? Okay,
that's quite a sort of sophisticated way of putting, if I've understood it correctly, you know, how is this law being integrated into a world which is effectively dominated by business? Am I correct? I mean, that's kind of what it feels like.
I mean, profit of a people.
So, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the way we see this is, it's actually a way of kind of strategically and almost acupuncturally inserting a particular piece into the system that will actually affect that overall cultural situation you just described. So effectively, at the moment, business's bottom line is actually also their legal obligation. So in most cases, it's a question of shareholder return. Your fiduciary duty as a board member, or, you know, as a CEO responsible to board members, for example, is to return a profit to your shareholders. And of course, there has been discussion of a kind of a triple bottom line, which has, you know, then led to kind of conversations around ESG and all of that sort of thing, which is obviously all steps in the right direction. But as with the multilateral environmental agreements, that kind of law is effectively soft law, and it's mostly non-law piece is actually a way of, in a sense, forcing that consideration of people before profit. And it's not just people, it's people and planet before profit. So it's a way of kind of integrating that. And in terms of strategies for it, I mean, our strategy is actually really quite simple. It's simply, I mean, you know, we make it as simple as we possibly can and as common sense as we possibly can by simply saying the worst harms should be crimes, because the worst harm, you know, that's the hardest thing to argue with. It's very difficult to say, you know, looking at the definition that you know, that we've got legally, which I think the link was put in the chat earlier, but you know, unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. It's almost like the definition itself carries the strategy, because that definition, I mean, I've yet to put it in the hands of anyone that looks at it and says that shouldn't be a crime. It has a kind of intuitive understanding that goes with it. And actually, that's super important when you're dealing at the level of politics, because most politicians don't have the time in their, you know, in their busy schedules, or, you know, the extraordinary range of things they have to deal with, to go through a 20-page report as to why this needs integrating into a system that, you know, that it will effectively change. But actually, when you look at that definition, it kind of carries everything you need to know in terms of the simplicity of, you know, creating a, in a sense, creating a moral imperative.
All right, thank you for that. I think it's the ripple effect that you will have on all this areas that run the profit world, or maybe the finance world, is something we need to look keen on. I will ask one question to Leah and one question to you, as I announced that we have 5 minutes left for questions and a bit of interactive session there. So to Leah, what is the intersection of rights of nature and the Ecocide Law?
Wow, and this is a big question actually, but I'm going to try and answer it as quick as I can. So essentially, what both rights of nature and Ecocide Law are trying to do is to give the environment rights for its intrinsic value, not just for its value to humans or to economic impact. And so they sort of connected through that like ecocentric vision of not just only, I mean, Ecocide takes a little bit of a both approach, which is quite nice. So it also synergizes with the current system that is anthropocentric in its outlook. So it does sort of prioritize human and economic well-being over that of nature. But it also has an element within it that says, you know, nature has a right to be protected in sort of intrinsically, which is the same as what rights of nature is all about, which is basically, I mean, a whole nother topic area, but about saying that, you know, nature has that, like, should be legally protected as a legal person, and sort of not just because of humans. And I mean, Ecocide Law is sort of almost an enforcement mechanism of rights of nature in a way. So to say that it can, rights of nature are, yes, it's the criminal way to say that, the worst destruction, sort of like, let's say we could say rights of nature are the right sort of to life, and an Ecocide Law is sort of the law that says you shall not murder. So yes, hopefully that explains what the idea behind it. But and Jojo or Davey, feel free to also add to that. But yeah, that's a very brief introduction on like the interlinks between them and how they are sort of part of that same coins, part of that same shift that we want to see within law to have a better protection of the environment.
Right, so on to the next question, I think to Jojo now. I was going to ask one question, but ask 2 parts again. So the question is, what is the link between the Ecocide Law and human rights? And I've also seen a question that's asking, couldn't the existing definition of crimes against humanity also be used to indict CEO of major companies? Like, can that the crime that's already existent also have a bit of ecocide in it?
That's a really good question. And actually, at the moment, there is a discussion at UN level around the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty, which would kind of transpose the Rome Statute crimes against humanity provisions into a UN treaty. And actually, there are a number of states that are in favour of adding environmental crimes as crimes against humanity as part of that. Of course, if they did that, it would have to be in the context of deliberate harm to the environment in order to damage people, if you see what I mean. So it's only ever going to be partial in what it can reach. But that doesn't mean it wouldn't be a useful thing to have in there. In terms of that connection, though, it is a really strong connection. And, as I say, I mean, as soon as we go to, what people can, some term producer countries, developing countries, countries that are very rich in raw materials, we're often finding that where ecocides are happening, massive human rights violations are also happening. So we would say that, and Leah touched on this briefly, that the ecocide does kind of cover both. It covers human harm as a result of environmental harm, but it also covers environmental harm per se. And I think it's very important to see those links, because at the moment, the fact that ecocide is not currently recognised at the international level means that it's harder for certain kinds of effectively human rights violations to then be justiciable. So, for example, there was a proposal, a complaint put into the International Criminal Court around Bolsonaro in Brazil, on the grounds of crimes against humanity. But we know some of the indigenous spokespeople who were associated with that. For example, Chief Rowney, who's quite possibly one of the best known indigenous spokespeople in the world, from the Kayapo people. And he's been clear that if ecocide had been in place, and he talks about ecocide in the submission, and if ecocide had been in place, potentially that crime could have been filed earlier. It could have been filed before it got to the extent where the crimes against humanity became such an issue that it was possible to do that. So, and also we can see from, for example, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, has very vocally spoken out and said that ecocide is going to, recognizing ecocide as a crime is going to be really important in the context of his work. So there is definitely a strong connection. And when it comes down to, this is really coming to the basics. If we don't look after the living world around us that sustain us, it's virtually impossible to sustain any of our human rights. So it's that kind of principle of the kind of no business on a dead planet, if you like, but transposed into effectively it's very difficult to uphold rights at all if we have a situation where the environment that sustains us is so degraded. So yeah, so there's a very fundamental level at which that's also intertwined.
Sorry. So I think that's quite some powerful ending there. We have a bit of time. I might sneak in one question for the people who managed to come. And I think it's quite interesting to see how much humanity needs this. And I think also other species and Earth really, really needs this. So I think I have seen a question that I will try to also embed and have Leah also answer it. In all these questions is one dominant question beneath it, and it's the question of, is there hope? So there.
What a wonderful question to end on. I am really passionate about this because I often think that we see hope as something that is like passive. Is it there or is it not there? Like, is there water or is there not water? But actually, I don't think hope is as passive as we make it out to be. Hope is an active state of mind. So it is us creating hope that is hope, And I think often they say, oh, youth are the hope, like people acting are hope. And for me, Ecocide Law is hope because it's an active solution. It's us actively trying to change laws and change the norms of our system to create change. So yes, there's hope.
Absolutely. And I completely agree with everything Leah said. And I think also, we sometimes forget how powerful we are. you know, as human beings, I mean, I fundamentally believe that after Mother Nature, human intent is the most powerful force on the planet. You know, we are ultimately the creators of reality. Everything that exists because someone at some point intended it to. So, you know, I think, yes, absolutely, there is hope. And we have absolutely agency in, you know, in creating, you know, the kind of reality that we actually want to be living in, as opposed to allowing other people's intents to shape that.
All right, intent. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and we hope we could hear from you. Our core team application is open till the 31st of this month, and we have lots of events coming through. If you're interested in this whole conversation about ecocide law in Africa, we have a similar session happening next week on Tuesday to answer this or more similar questions in the African context. So our email is in the chat, and I will repeat it again. If you have questions, if you want to get involved, if you want to have more conversations on Ecocide and how they can be integrated into your works or your places, you could join us, either Youth for Ecocide Law, Students, Ambassadors, or Stop Ecocide International. Most of our work is found on our websites, both the Stop Ecocide one and the Youth one. And we have interactive WhatsApp, we have cool things. So thank you so much for coming. And as we finish today, I think there's hope as well. A few 100 years ago, the basic even right to life was not a thing, but today it is. So the fact that we're dreaming for the future and we're seeing this as a legacy that maybe a few years from now, people will talk about that, you know, we used to do this with the environment, now we don't, is enough hope that it is possible and it will happen. So thank you so much for coming, and we'll see you in the next time.
Thank you. Become part of the Act of Hope and join Ecocide and Ecocide, Youth of Ecocide Law.